I listened to yesterday, and I noticed that when I listened to the original 4-track that I'd done of that in fact I had overdubbed the voice. But I'd forgotten this.
Yeah.
And what I'd done originally was I'd recorded Paul singing and playing at the same time. Guitar, and mucked up both guitar and voice. And then later I wrote and overdubbed the strings. That's 2 tracks. And sorry, it's 3 tracks. Where I put one of the guitar on one track and voice on another, and strings. And on my 4th track, I got Paul in and said, "Look, have another go at recording the voice, just in case we get a better performance." Well, we didn't get a better performance. At least I didn't. In my opinion, we didn't, except one particular part, which was the end of the first section. And so I used that as an alternative voice. And I've always thought, during the past 20 years, I've forgotten about that was where, for some little aberration of mine, I decided to double track the voice. But it's not double track. Because what it is, it's voice with a leakage from a speaker, because we didn't use headphones. So it's actually, I do the same thing again when I remix it. It is just a transposition of one voice, but it's a very, very small part.
Yeah, because when I sort of question about dropping in on vocals is a leading question away. It's just something that's intrigued me over the years, which is that obviously, like you say, it was more a live feel in those days than these days where things just redone and redone and redone. But it's just certain things in the vocals where they might sing out of time, or one sings a slightly different lyric to another. And I wondered if they just sort of slipped through, or it was just decided almost like an in-joke, let's leave it and see if anyone notices, or...
Well, if there were mistakes, and there was, so quite often John and Paul would sing a different lyric, that kind of thing, you know.
Yeah, that has existed, it has got through on a few of the songs,
But that was never intended. I mean, they did it that way. And are you saying that there are other versions where it's been corrected?
No, I mean the released versions, where, I mean, I can hear, you know...
Yeah, but that was because it was live, and because it set my attention when we did it.
I see. And even like on the mix of...
Yeah, Cooper. Again, I didn't think it was all that important.
That's what I wanted to know.
Once it went through, once I saw it was there, I didn't think it was worthwhile calling them, and again, let's replace this line.
Right.
Life's too short.
Fair enough. Okay, we come on to Sgt. Pepper. Were there any times, I mean, obviously you were wholly involved in the project, you were translating their ideas into music. Obviously they got to the stage where I suppose they felt that, you know, they could just carry things further and further. Were there ever times when you sat back during the making of the project with tracks, say, As a Day in the Life, which was so revolutionary for a pop song, and you thought, no, hold it. Maybe people are just never going to sort of buy this, you know, just never going to go for this. It's too much. It's too different. Did you ever sort of lose your nerve at any point during the project?
Not seriously. No, I mean, I did actually, particularly on Day in the Life, when I finished doing the orchestral bit. One part of me said, we're being a bit self-indulgent. We're being a little bit over the top. One part of me said that. The other part of me said, it's bloody marvellous. I think it's fantastic, you know. And I was thoroughly reassured when I was on the point, before I put the thing together, when I actually let an American visitor hear a bit of Day in the Life.
So I was interested in hearing if anyone else had.
And when that happened, they did a handstand, and I said, oh, well, we're all right then. You know, we're not... And that was my worries were over. It wasn't anything serious. I never really seriously worried about it.
And after Pepper was finished, and it received all the acclaim, did you ever have a feeling that we can't really go any further than this, we can't really progress?
No, I didn't feel that, actually. I mean, I thought that while we've been self-indulgent and a little bit over the top, but it was great and it was glorious, I thought we could extend that. I thought we could make another album which would be a little bit more controlled, in fact, and still have moments and still have expression for the Beatles' originality and ingenuity. But I wanted to take lessons. I tried to get the boys to accept that there had to be a definite form in the records. And Paul would listen to me, but John wouldn't. And as you know, after that, the Beatle White Album, then there was Let It Be, and I thought things would finish. And we didn't come round again until Abbey Road. Abbey Road was the kind of Sgt. Pepper Mark II. And Abbey Road was the last thing we ever did. And Paul went along with the idea, but John didn't. So it became a compromise, so that one side of Abbey Road was very much the way John wanted things. Let's all hang out, let's rock a little, boy. And the other one was what Paul had accepted from me, which was to try and think in symphonic terms, and think in terms of having a first and second subject, and having them put in different keys, and contrapuntal work even, and bringing back themes. And
that's the second side, all the segues and things.
And Paul dug that. He quite liked that, and that was why that side sounds as it does. It still wasn't quite what I was looking for, but it was going towards it.
The segues, were they intended? Were they introductions of yours, or
on Pepper, or
on well, actually on both, but more so on Abbey Road?
On Abbey Road, certainly, yeah.
What, your own introduction that was?
Well, it was my idea to have a continuously moving piece of music, and wherever possible we would segue, we would actually design an insert to work that way.
I see.
That was the idea. And in the case of Pepper, I always fancied the idea of having something that was as continuous as possible. And I didn't really know how it would work until I started putting it together. And it was then that it grew. I mean, when you have a number of disparate songs which don't have a connection, and you've got to try and make them work together, you don't know how they're going to work until you start doing it.
Yes.
But Abbey Road was more designed.
What was it like recording Abbey Road? I mean, was it their swan song at the time? Or, I mean, when you were recording it, did you think this is it, you know? Or was it enjoyable?
I think so, yes. I mean, we had been very unhappy during Let It Be. Let It Be was a miserable experience. And I never thought we would get back together again. And I was quite surprised when Paul rang me up and said, we all want to make another record. Will you produce another one for us? And he said, will you really produce it? I said, if I'm really allowed to produce it, I'll really produce it. I said, if I have to go back and accept a lot of instructions which I don't like, then I won't do it. And Paul said, no, we really want you to produce it like you used to. So that was, and once we got back in the studio, it really was nice. The boys tended to record their own items. And in fact, we would work sometimes in different studios at the same time. And I would have Chris Thomas working with me and helping out. So I would sort of be dashing from one studio to another. On particular tracks, you know, where more forces were needed, then the other boys would come in. I mean, on Because, for example, very much a John song, but it needed the combined singing of the three men. So obviously it became a joint effort.
But was it piecemeal recording, or did they ever record as a group?
Oh, they recorded as a group.
They recorded as a group.
You can't sing like that unless you actually, I mean, on Because, that particular track started off with John having the idea, the sort of riff on the guitar, which he played to me, and the basic song, which he sang to me. And what we did then, we created a backing with him still playing the guitar on that riff, and I duplicated exactly every note that he played on the guitar on an electric harpsichord, and Paul played bass. And there was nothing for Ringo to do, because he didn't know what drums it, but in fact there was something for him to do, because I couldn't, because it was so slow and meticulously, the question of ensemble between the guitar and the harpsichord had to be, each note had to be exactly together.
Right.
And I'm not the world's greatest player in time, and I would make more mistakes than John did. So we had Ringo beating a hi-hat all the time to us in headphones, so we had a regular beat. We didn't have drum machines in those days. And so Ringo was our drum machine, and that was the way we did the track. And then, having got the track, then the three boys sang together in harmony, the whole song. And then we overlaid another three voices, and then another three voices. So we had 9-part harmony all the way through, and that was Because.
What about effects? I mean, were there any effects on things like, the track comes to mind to me is Lovely Rita on Pepper, with all these sort of different noises happening. I mean, do you recall how any of that was done in those days?
Which track, sorry?
Lovely Rita.
Lovely Rita, Meter Maid.
Well, you've got these weird noises, things happening in the background all the time.
Well, we did several things. We'd often used to do things in the studio, which was always fun. I mean, it made life a little bit more interesting. I mean, most notable case was Yellow Submarine.
Right.
Of course, you know, where you got blowing bubbles into tanks and making noises and chains rattling and that kind of thing, which we actually did in the studio. It was fun to do. And John got one of these little hand mics which he put onto his Vox amp, which he was able to talk through. So he was able to cutting, all that, which you hear, and that was done live while the main vocal was going, and it just made life a bit more interesting and fun. We had a giggle. In Lovely Rita, the same thing happened. We would have actual effects in the studio, but we weren't averse to putting recorded effects in too.
What sort of effects would you have at that time in the studio?
Well, there would be all sorts of sound effects that you can get on record.
Oh, I see.
You know,
yes.
so I mean, in the case of Good Morning, and you know, there's a whole farmyard event, which was dubbed in from a disc.
And what about things like the voice, John's voice on the last verse of Tomorrow Never Knows? Was that achieved by flanging the voice?
Yeah, it was done on a his specification to me was he never liked his voice, by the way. He always hated his voice.
That's right. People said he always wanted it mixed down, didn't he?
Yeah, and I could never understand this because I thought his voice was terrific. But on Tomorrow Never Knows, he said, as you know, the words were taken from To Debate in the Book of the Dead. He said, I want me to sound as though I'm a Dalai Lama singing from the highest mountain top, and yet I want to still be able to hear what I'm singing. And of course it was an impossible task, except that I thought, well, he obviously wanted a cookie effect. And flanging was about the double track, artificial double tracking was about the only thing we could think of. We didn't have machines that you could do things. We didn't have harmonizers or anything like that. So what I did was I put his voice through the Leslie rotating speaker of the Hammond organ, which gave it that effect.
I see.
And to my knowledge, that's the first time anyone had ever done that. It did what he wanted. It was quite a nice effect.
And on other sort of albums, things like the White Album, there are a few tracks where I heard people playing with the speed, and it sounded as if the vocals that we were used to hearing had been in fact sped up, because when they were slowed down it sounded more. I mean, I'm thinking of a track like Don't Pass Me By, Ringo's vocal. Was that actually sped up?
No.
It wasn't meddled with at all?
No. We did occasionally do that, but on Don't Pass Me By I don't think we did.
No.
I could be wrong, but as my memory tells me not.
Yes.
We weren't, again, you know, if it was an attempt to get an effect, we would actually speed up the track and put them in different keys, and sometimes, if the voice was too much restrained, I would actually speed up the track or slow down the track in order to accommodate the voice, and then take it back up again. But I never went beyond a semitone because it got kind of Mickey Mousey after that.
Right. On Pepper, did anyone else play on the album that weren't sort of credited at all? Were there a lot of people sitting in on sessions and things? Or did the Beatles themselves sort of play each other's instruments at all? Was there any mixing around?
God. I mean, it's a big subject because a lot of people did play on Pepper. Including a 42-piece orchestra, and I don't know the names of them.
We're not so much asking for names as to the fact that...
You're thinking of famous people, right? You think of people like Brian Jones and like Mick Jagger and people like that. As far as I know, I don't think anybody famous performed on Pepper. Don't think so.
Did they switch instruments a lot, the Beatles, within the sessions?
Well, they all played keyboards in one manner or another, bad and good. They all played guitar instruments, bad or good, and they all played. They all liked playing different, you know, experimenting with different things, and so they would all pick up a percussion thing. Whatever move, you know, ever happened to be around at the time. It wasn't until later that they did things like George doing a violin and Paul doing rather bad recorders on the Magic Mystery Tour and so on. But in Pepper, I don't think there were any instruments like that.
When it got to the White Album stage, did Paul do any of the drumming on the White Album?
That's a big question, and I don't really know the answer. Paul liked drumming, and when his own song came along, he often liked to do his own drumming, but he was also conscious that Ringo felt rather bad about it. And he might possibly have done a track. I would have to check on the records to find that out. Although I think if I had to sort of give you a definite answer, yes or no, I would say no, because we were very conscious of Ringo not being done out of a job, and Ringo was a great drummer. But Paul sometimes got a little bit impatient about getting his ideas over. But I don't think so. I think that Paul left his drumming expertise to when he had wings.
As a music man, can you expand on that? I mean, it has been said by Paul himself that he thought, for them, Ringo was the greatest drummer in the world. Can you expand on that? Why?
Why he was great?
Yeah, because obviously, like, you know, most people say, Ringo himself would say, technically, if you put it next to some people,
I mean,
wouldn't stand up. But
no, that's right. I had, when I recorded Tug of War in Montserrat with Paul, and we had Stevie Wonder and we had Ringo playing drums, and we also had Steve Gadd. Now, Steve Gadd is a great technical drummer. One of the best in the world, you know, he's done everything, and he's meticulous. And we actually had the two drum sets in the studio, and Ringo and Steve playing together. And first of all, it was most interesting that for the same mic setup, the sounds were so completely different. I mean, they were light years apart, the sound of the two drum sets. I was shaken by it. I didn't expect it to be. Ringo gets a particular sound out of his drums, which is all Ringo, and I don't know anybody else who gets that particular sound. So that's one of the reasons why I think he's great. I think he is extremely distinctive. You can recognize Ringo's sound anywhere. Secondly, I think that although his timekeeping isn't rigid, clinical, quartz-controlled accuracy, he's got a tremendous feel for a song, and I think he always helped us to hit the right tempo for a song, and gave it that support, that kind of rock-solid backbeat that made the recording of all the Beatles songs that much easier because of that. He was sympathetic. His playing used to go up and down, but he used to go up and down in the right way to help the song. And his use of toms, I think, was very inventive too. You know, the day in the life timpani sound on the toms was very characteristic. That's what Ringo wanted, and that's what he got. It was his idea to do it.
do you think there was also an art in the fact, was it his art or was it your art, that the drumming in the Beatles didn't dominate, like, say, Keith Moon with the Who's, you know, much more sort of to the front, it was more featured. The thing with the Beatles is you don't notice the drumming so much, it just fits into the picture. Was that more Ringo, or you arranging it that way from the start, from the early days?
Well, it was probably the balance more than anything else. I was turned on to drums by Ringo, in effect, because I was never a great drum person before I met the Beatles, and certainly I didn't pay the attention to, particularly the bass end of the drum kit, the bass drum in particular, until they came along. And I was quite surprised at Ringo's insistence on getting the thing recorded right. But I've always held the belief that the song and the singer is the most important part of the record, and the drums help it, but they're not, that should no way dominate it. So I guess that the question of balance, in my mind, was gave you the effect that you wanted. But I think Ringo agreed with it. I think that Ringo saw that what we were doing on record was right. He never once came to me and complained that his drums weren't loud enough. So I presume he approved.
Now, something else that's always struck me again is, I mean, amazing thing about the Beatles, which is never really mentioned, is this incredible progression from album to album. I mean, people seem to forget, you know, sort of within months. I mean, there's a world of difference between Please Please Me and with the Beatles. And, you know, I mean, and it just goes on and on. There's also a different sound to each album. I mean, for instance, the distinctive thing to me about Hard Day's Night is George's 12-string Rickenbacker permeates that. And I think it was Hammond organ on the Hell album. Now, was that a conscious thing, like, let's give it this album this sound as such?
No. Well, I mean, we didn't set out to say, let's make this album a different one from the other one, and therefore we're going to have a different sound. It wasn't there. But there was this eternal curiosity that all the boys had to have something new. And as they were growing up, I mean, I've often said that they were like plants in a hothouse. See, when I first met them, George and Paul were 18. 18 years old, kids. And immediately they became world stars almost, well, within a year. And so their normal kind of growing up period was taken away from them by the pressures of fame. So they grew up in the studio with me. and up to the point of Pepper, where they were expanding their ideas. Consequently, they were thirsty for knowledge. They were thirsty to find out, curious to find out what else they could have. And with the fame that came with them, they had the opportunity of experimenting. So that George, heard of the Rickenbacker 12-string and wanted to have one, and he got one, and then everybody wanted one. And whenever you had a fashion starting like that, for example, once I turned John's voice around on Rain and played his voice backwards to him and put it in the track. Great, let's try everything backwards. And so George started doing backwards guitar solos, and as you know, we had backwards cymbal on Strawberry Fields, and so everything was backwards for a while until that was exhausted, and then it was onto a new gimmick. It was just a healthy curiosity of finding new sounds and new ways of expressing themselves.
How do you manage to arrange something like a backward guitar obbligato and things like I'm Only Sleeping? I mean, how in hell's name can you work that out, basically?
You obviously work out what your chord sequence is. You work out where the chords are, and in fact, we write down the reverse order of the chords as they're going to come up so you can recognize them. So you learn to play a chord sequence, and you learn to boogie around on that chord sequence. And then sometimes, you listen to it, you don't really know what it's going to sound like till it comes out again.
Make it sound very simple.
Well, it's not simple, but it is hit or miss. There's no doubt about it. But you do it a few times, and when you like what you hear, then you keep it.
When it got to the White Album, did you yourself begin to lose interest with the fact that they were recording everything so piecemeal? I mean, I know that there are certain sessions, there were 3 sessions going at the same time.
That's right.
Did you yourself begin to sort of think, just losing interest in this whole thing?
No, it wasn't a question of losing interest. It was a question of being able to cope with all, because they came back from India and they had 32 songs they wanted to record. And I listened to every one of them, and a lot of them I didn't think were great. And I told them so, and I said, look, recording 32 songs is silly. Let's get down the right number, and let's get down 14 or 16 songs, eliminate the dubious ones, concentrate and make really great tracks. They wouldn't have that. They just insisted on doing all of them. They said, let's do them all, and then you can turn them down if you want to. And so, but they all wanted to do them all at the same time, so that George would be in one studio, and John would be in another, and Paul would be in another. And that's where Chris Thomas was helping me at the time. He was running around looking after George or whatever, and I hope we just ran around all the time, trying to get the right recordings out. It wasn't until long after that I discovered that the reason for them wanting to have 32 tracks recorded wasn't entirely artistic. That their contract, which had been renegotiated for them by Brian, stipulated that the contract would expire within a certain period of time or within a certain number of titles recorded. And the more titles they recorded, the quicker they got out of the contract. I didn't know that, and I was naive enough to think that they just wanted things artistically.
Is there any truth in the story that Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane were originally intended for the album? But
absolutely, yes. Strawberry Fields was the beginning of Pepper. It was...
was it intended as a double album? Is it true also that some of the Magical Mystery Tour tracks were originally intended to be...
No, I never thought in double album terms, no. We didn't set out with each album to say, this is the way the album's going to sound, and this one's going to be called Sgt. Pepper, it's going to have such and such and such on it. What happened was that Brian would allocate some time to me for getting the Beatles in the studio, and we had a general plan of having 2 albums a year and 4 singles a year. And when the time came for the next album project to come up, then Brian would say, I've penciled in these dates for you in the studios, and then we're having a break at Christmas and you're coming back in and so on. So in December 66, we went into the studios and we produced Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane and When I'm 64 in that batch of recordings, those 3 titles. Then we had Christmas off, came back into the studios in 1967, and then worked through sporadically until the record was actually issued in June 67. So that Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane were intended to be part of the album, but the album wasn't called Pepper, nor did it become Pepper until Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band were actually written by Paul way into the album. Already the album was a third done. And it was only at that stage, having written the song and recorded it, that he had the idea. He said, well, why don't we make ourselves a pepper band? And that became the way the thing grew. So it was no grand plan. The reason why Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane didn't become part of the album was that, it sounds idiotic now, but in those days we never, ever put a single onto an album.
Yeah.
And we needed a single for Christmas, or for New Year, or whatever it was. And so we rushed out Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane.
What was the situation with the financing by that time? I mean, would you know about that? I mean, were you involved on that side? Sort of?
No, because I negotiated the first contract. You see, before the Beatles came along, I ran Parlophone Records. I was responsible for the whole label, and I recorded everything that went on it, and responsible for all the finances and all the contracts. But it was a very small label. Once the Beatles came along, and 62 went into 63, and Brian and I became firm friends, and we talked in terms of close partnerships and having with wonderful stable of people we could find that I could record. And at that point, I got on a golden treadmill. Actually, it was a copper treadmill for me, where I was in the studio all the time. You know, that 1963 year, I just recorded and recorded and recorded every day, every weekend. And my administrative side was falling away because I had so much work to do. You know, that was the year that I had 37 weeks at number 1 out of 52. And I just never want to work that hard again. And so consequently, that was the beginning of my not getting involved in the financial side of the Beatles. Their original contract that I signed them to was a miserly one, but that secured them to EMI for 4 years. And after the first year, I went to the managing director of EMI and said, look, you should double their royalty. He said, why? I said, well, because we've got them for another 3 years, but I think they're giving us so much that they're not getting enough. He said, okay, I'll double their royalty if we get another 5 years options out of them. And I refused to do it. Maybe that was the reason. I said, no, if you want to do that, you do it yourself. I won't go to the Beatles and offer them such. I said, I'll give them the money, but I won't ask any more from them. And so that original, they only had an old penny per single between the 5 of them, including Brian. So when the contract was renegotiated at the end of the 4 years, Brian went directly to Sir Joe Lockwood, head of EMI, and did that deal, which was a better deal than we'd had, but still wasn't the deal they ended up with, which was fantastic. So I don't know the details on them, but I know they were big.
And with the actual financing of a project like Pepper, were you sort of instructed as to that this is how long you've got basically for the project?
No, I was very much my own boss at Parlophone, always, and I was a bit of a maverick, and I never had much money, but I did have my own way, and I will say that EMI let me have my own way. So that when it came to planning anything for my label, I had the final word. So if I wanted to go and spend 5 months in doing an album, it was my neck was on the chopping block if I didn't make it. But I did make it, so there was no problem. Nobody questioned it.
So in other words, the sort of stories I've heard about, panic in the offices of EMI with Pepper taking so long to make.
I'm sure there was panic, but nobody could say anything to me because it was my charge. Right. Nobody could threaten me or anything. I could have easily. They couldn't do anything about it. Right.
And how did you sort of your role as producer mix with the various engineers that you worked with? I know there were a lot of different engineers over the years.
Well, there had to be, because there was so much work to do.
And what was your relationship, and did that relationship change over the years as recording techniques changed?
Not really. You say there's a lot of engineers, but in fact they weren't all that. If there were many, they only did sporadic little items. There was no consistency of.
And I know the two main ones would have been Norman Smith and Jeff Emmerich.
Norman Smith carried on up to Revolver from the very beginning. And then Norman Smith wanted to be a producer, and he had a group that he found that he thought were terrific. So he went off to be a producer, and the group he found was Pink Floyd. And afterwards he became Harrison Smith. And the tape-op I had at the time was Jeff Emmerich, who was 18. And I said, if you think you can take it, I'll toss you in the deep end. And he thought he could take it, so he did. He jumped in. And the first track he did was Tomorrow Never Knows. And then he did the whole of Pepper. So from then on, we went on together, right through the Beatles. Now, the Beatles chopped and changed too. They didn't get rid of me. Well, I suppose they could have done. But they actually said, for example, on Let It Be, they didn't want Jeff Emmerich on Let It Be. And they had used Glenn Johns.
Was that as an afterthought when the project had been shelved for a time, or was this from the offset?
From the off. And when we used another studio, if we went to Olympic, obviously we didn't take Jeff then. It would be Keith Grant would do the track. Baby I'm Rich Man was Keith Grant. If we went to Trident, then we'd have Ken Scott. And so that's how we got different engineers. And later on, Peter Vince did some work at EMI. But in the main bulk of the work was done by Norman Smith, first of all, and Jeff Emmerich, secondly.
And how did you work with the engineer? I mean, basically...
Well, with Jeff, with both Norman and Jeff, because I knew them so well. And in Jeff's case, I mean, he was a child when we started. It was a question of telling them what I wanted and getting it. And then eventually, after not very long, they knew what I wanted, so I didn't have to say much. And to this day, I can work with Jeff, and I shall know that what I'm getting is what I want. Jeff and I can work together on an album, and we don't need so much to each other. But we know, he knows what I'm thinking, and I know what he's thinking. It's just kind of empathy to get on with people.
Would you stick purely to the music and leave him to sort of
I always
the miking?
I've always done that. I think the role of a producer, a musical producer, and a technical engineer in complete compatibility is a very good one. I think it's much better than a producer/stroke engineer who's worrying whether that note's in tune at the same time as worrying what the spill is like on the drum mic. I don't think you should have to do those two things together. I think that two good brains are better than one if they're working well together. But in a case of a producer who doesn't work well with an engineer, then I take back what I said. But we did work well together. And I would only override, if I didn't like something technical, I mean, if I thought I was getting the wrong kind of vocal sound, I would ask him to change the mic or whatever. You know, there would be those overriding things. But because we knew each other so well, I would know what he would tend to do. And he would explain to me, he said, I've got a new thing I want to try out. And I'd say, okay, let's listen to it. And I'd give him a judgment on it, that kind of thing. And it eventually got to a cooperation where he would say to me, have you noticed that harmony of George's doesn't quite work? And he would always spill into my ear sometimes.
Yes.
But that was fine. That was the way we cooperated, and that was good for all of us.
Do you, these days, with all the sort of technology that there is to hand, do you ever have any kind of longing at all for the old days where it was all go in there and thrash out a good song live?
Very much so, but not from any fuddy-duddiness. It's just a question that I think that, I mean, the thing is, with all this advance in technology, it hasn't made the music any better.
In fact, what I find off-putting is when I've spoken to some artists who I say to them, do you compose? Oh yes, I've got a studio at home and knock out things mucking around there. And I thought, well, anyone can do that.
That's right. Well, the trouble is that people now, because of the layer cake system of recording, of just doing everything individually, people tend not to play together. And more than that, the engineers don't get a chance to hear them playing together. So if you have young blood coming up through the engineering side, half the engineers in the studios, you go around any studio in London today and pick up a young boy and say, when did you record a live band last? Have you ever recorded an orchestra? And I bet you get negative results. They haven't had the experience. They don't know about it. And I think that's such a shame. You know, I think recording something that exists as a piece of music from a number of people is the only real way to get real great music. And too much is done in a clinical way. I mean, the strive for accuracy at all costs, the microchip and the quartz business of it's made a different kind of mentality. It made the computer mentality where they don't believe anything unless they see it on a meter. And it is sad.
How do you, in that context, how do you rate compact discs?
Well, there again, you see, I think compact discs are wonderful, but I don't see them as a threat. I've never seen technology as a threat for myself because I've always used it. It's never used me. And I think that compact discs are wonderful in that they give you the sound in your own home that I can get in the studio. To me, that's the final end product. I think the dynamic range, I think the frequency range, I think is terrific. I think the classical recording is superb. You know, I can hear the most gentlest of pianissimos without all the snap, crackle, pop of my nasty old vinyls. And I can hear a really full-blooded tutti without it hurting, which on vinyl tends to.
Do you find it lacks any degree of warmth?
People say this to me, and I don't. I have heard digital multi-track recordings which lack that warmth that people talk about. And in fact, Jeff Emmerich and I have talked about this a lot, and he says that he can hear the difference of the complete cut-off at 20 kilohertz. He said, I know I can't hear above 20 kilohertz, he said, but I can hear the fact that it isn't there. And I don't, obviously my hearing isn't as good as that. I'm much older now, I don't have the frequency range I used to have. But I've never been able to detect that difference. I have on multi-track digital, I've heard the kind of the clinical quality there, but the system that we use I think is closer to analog than anything, which is the Mitsubishi 32 track.
Yes.
I think it's very warm, and I like that. But on CDs, I don't think so. I think if you hear something if you hear a master tape in the control room, and then you have a CD made of it, and you play that CD in the same control room, I can't tell the difference.
Back to the Beatles. I remember you being interviewed on TV in 1980 when they were celebrating John's 40th birthday, and I think a guy asked you a question that, would you, I don't know did you foresee yourself recording with him again, or would you like to? And I think you just said, you didn't imagine you would be sort of recording with him again. Was that down to just sort of situation?
In 1980, this one?
Yeah, this is in 80.
Before
he died.
John Lennon.
Yeah, John Lennon, when it was his 40th birthday. Was that because of just the situation, you just didn't foresee it coming round to that again? Or was it because, as a solo artist, you leant more towards Paul's style of making music than John's?
No, I didn't lean more towards Paul's style of music, but Paul asked me and John didn't. I didn't expect, after the Beatles split up, I didn't expect to work with any of them again, because they learnt a great deal in the decade that we were together. And they became very good producers, every one of them. I mean, George made very good recordings, and John as a producer wasn't as good as the others, but he still had tremendous invention. And so they didn't need producers. When John worked with Phil Spector, it was because, particularly on the rock and roll album, because he was part of that old era and he wanted him to do that, although John got tired of that too. He didn't like what he was doing, and he was going to happy about the rock and roll album. So John tended not to use producers, but became more engineer-producer people. So when he did Double Fantasy, he worked with a fellow who did Aerosmith and so on.
Yes,
Jack
Douglas.
Jack Douglas, who was an engineer-producer, basically. And so I could see that need. I certainly wasn't an engineer producer. And so John never asked me, although we were still good friends. I don't think John would have... John never particularly liked being produced in my sense. He liked things to be just sort of let it all hang out. He never wanted any... If he wanted an orchestration, he would hire an arranger to do it, and it would work out. But John, the other thing was that John was never satisfied. And he once said to me in one of our evenings together when we were swapping reminiscences, he said, George, I've never really liked anything we've ever done. And I said, really, John? I said, you made some fantastic records. He said, if I could do them all over again, I would. So John was always looking for something which was impossible, in fact, unattainable, and he'll never get it.
Why would you say that he wasn't as good a producer as the others, in terms of what?
Well, because he didn't have the discipline. He didn't have the... John would... if he didn't get something quickly, he would grow tired of it and then freak out on something, His way of producing was very much a hit-or-miss thing. Whereas Paul and George would be much more meticulous and George in particular would be do the same thing over and over again so many thousands of times. Everybody would start raving mad. But John tended to, if he didn't get it in the first take, he would go on to something else.
I've spoken to a few people who have worked with Paul, as producers, or Hugh Padgham, Chris Conti's worked with him. And the thing that they sort of had to admit to is that when it comes to maybe discussing a point, they may express their point of view, he'll express his, and they can't help but feel, when it comes down to it, I mean, he must know what he's talking about after all of what he's done. Do you feel in that way, without obviously you coming over as if you're sort of advertising yourself, do you feel in that way that you've got something unique there that you've known Paul and worked with Paul since, before he was a star, before he knew about production and things like that, and you're the one person who can really make a point against him and feel quite confident.
Well, to our disadvantage. But I mean, I suppose you mentioned Paul because we worked together on
Yes.
the war and so on,
Yes.
and Types of Peace and so on. And yes, but I found that obviously with all of them, that everyone, I don't care who it is, how great they are, they need a second opinion. They need someone to say, wait a minute, are you sure you're doing that right thing? Even if it is only to question a decision, they need a second voice. Not necessarily to change anything, but just say, right, let's look at it again and look at the whole picture. Because people tend to get so bound up with what they're doing that they can't see the wood for the trees. And the producer's main function is to be able to step back and see the whole picture, not just the little leaf in the corner, but the whole lot, and to give an unbiased opinion about it. Now, it's very difficult for a creator of something, an originator, a writer, a singer, who has written the song and performing it and got the whole idea, to be able to look at it completely unjaundiced. And the other thing is, of course, that when you get as rich and famous as the Beatles do, everyone thinks you're fantastic, and you are, of course, and everybody tells you so. And you get a lot of people who don't mean to be sycophants, but they are, and they wouldn't dream of saying anything untoward. So that's a fantastic song you've got there. Well, it's maybe not be a fantastic song, maybe it's a very ordinary song, but because you're singing it, I'm in love with you, it's a fantastic song. And so the amount of people who are able to say to the Emperor, you're not wearing any clothes, Jim, aren't very many. And one thing I could do, I could say to any of them, you're not wearing any clothes. And that's the main value.
And will you ever sort of do that in terms of, obviously, I mean, it's his album, but would you ever sort of say to him, I really just don't think that will go, I just don't think that is a good idea?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Which is something that possibly the others would
If you don't do that, you're not doing a job. You're not being... You must... The awful thing is, though, you must never do it unless you believe in it 100%. If I were to go to any of my artists and try and score a point, saying, this is not the way to do it, this is the way you do it, old boy, and if I didn't know in my heart of hearts that what I was saying was absolutely 100% right, then I wouldn't do it. You've got to be totally convinced that you're making a good point without trying to score off anybody. And if you can do that, then you should be totally honest and say, it's a dodo, don't do it, or do it this way, or speed it up, or slow it down, or for Christ's sake, don't do that, you're making a mistake. And you could have arguments, and I have had arguments, but it's necessary because in the end they'll value your opinion.
Do you think is the Beatles' their best album, as opposed to your favourite album?
We're looking back?
Yeah, looking back now.
Oh.
As a whole, I mean, because some people tend to think that Revolver has stood up to the test of time, for instance, better than
Well, my favourites, you see, it depends on what mood I'm in. If I'm listening to Abbey Road, I say, isn't that lovely, it's super. My favourites are Abbey Road, going backwards, Abbey Road, Sgt. Pepper, Revolver and Rubber Soul. Undoubtedly those four. I still have also a sneaking regard for the first two, particularly with the Beatles. Because it was the first time we got in the studio where we had a little bit of time, and there are an awful lot of great old rockers in there. And when they covered songs, they were very good too. They don't do that anymore. Well, they didn't do that later.